Hello, everyone, and welcome to Security Pain Points. I'm Emily Paddock from Tevora's account management team. Today, Kevin Dick, manager of our threat services practice, will take us through confronting challenging threats. If there are any questions, please use the chat function in the GoToMeeting, and we will address them at the end of the presentation. And so to kick this off, I'd like to iterate Tevora has been doing consulting work in the information security risk and compliance space for 16 years. We have over 100 consultants on staff that specialize in enterprise risk assessment, data privacy, cloud security, solutions advisory and implementation, point-in-time security compliance frameworks, including ISO, SOC, PCI, HIPAA, and HITRUST, and of course, threat services in the form of pen testing, security awareness, red teaming, incident response, and more. So with that being said, Kevin, the floor is all yours.
Great. Thank you for the introduction, Emily. Hey guys, happy you could join us today. Really just wanted to take this time to share the findings we come across during pen testing that are both very easy to exploit and on the flip side, pretty difficult to remediate. So hoping to walk you through some of those issues here, how we go about discovering them, how we're doing as an industry, where we're at, and hopefully give you guys some guidance on, first of all, be ready to expect these things on your pen test report. And then second of all, some guidance on how you can kind of get in front of them and start remediating them. Now we've broken up the agenda into basically three major sections here. So passwords, what we'll go over first, and security pain points, nothing more painful than passwords on many occasions. Microsoft has its own section. There's a ton of weird quirks with Windows and just horrible things that you can do due to old Microsoft setups. And then diving into some phishing and C2, how we go about that as attackers and why they can be difficult to kind of get in front of and stop. And then finally diving in again to recommendations, things you can do to kind of get in front of these issues. Along the way, feel free to type your questions in the chat. Like Emily said, we're going to have a Q&A at the end as well to kind of go through any questions you may have. And other than that, let's go ahead and just dive right into it. So first, I want to start off with passwords, right? And these are something pretty much no matter where you are, you're going to have to deal with. They're the de facto method of authentication, and they come with some problems. Chiefly that you're basically putting your users to be directly responsible for the security of their account, right? Because many times the strength of their password directly correlates to how secure their account is going to ultimately be. And so how are our users doing, right? And unfortunately, it's pretty terrible, but it isn't their fault. So we've empowered our users, or rather, we're kind of forced to empower our users to create these passwords, but humans are not good at generating and remembering high entropy strings. Yet that's essentially what we're asking them to do when we say, go choose a long, complex password, change it every 90 days, and make sure you don't forget it or write it down on a Post-it note, right? And essentially, users go out and they're choosing passwords that look to be high entropy, but unfortunately are totally not. And the reason being is, how do we enforce that they're high entropy, right? We're basically putting complexity rules in front of the users. And so that's something like, you need to have a number, you need to have a capital, add a special digit. The problem is when the human is choosing these passwords, they're essentially going out and they're placing those things that meet the complexity rules in very predictable areas, which ultimately just makes the passwords harder to remember, but doesn't necessarily increase the entropy, right? So there's a lot of common structural tendencies that have been identified. And we as pen testers and of course attackers out there that are cracking passwords are going out there and they're leveraging these tendencies to figure out what those passwords are going to look like, using rule lists with tools like Hashcat to basically say, hey, we're going to capitalize the first letter, put an exclamation mark at the end, add some numbers to the end, and you end up with a password that looks complex but is ultimately relatively weak. And now we'll get into a little later why weak passwords, where those kind of chain breaks and why we can exploit them so much. But just know that the users essentially on our pen test, we're seeing typical crack rates of 60 to 80% when we dump an AD-SAM. So what is the solution, right? So one of these comics that came out a little while back at SACD, some of you guys may recognize this, but they had kind of a unique idea where they were taking it from just kind of an entropy perspective, looking at, hey, how are we currently doing passwords, right? We're taking a common word, we're maybe doing some substitutions, doing caps at the beginning, adding some stuff to the end, and doing analysis here. That's really only 28 beats of entropy, but that's gonna be really hard for a user to remember, right? So you're looking at this and you're thinking, okay, wait, was it a trombone? Where did I substitute the 0, or was that a 4, right? It's hard for the user to remember, but really easy to guess. Another method that they suggest is basically doing 4 random common words. And if you look at this, it's kind of interesting, right? Because you'll come in and you'll actually see that that has 44 bits of entropy, which actually, again, is not super sufficient if you're doing GPU cracking, but do 5 common words, and that actually looks really good. And their point is we basically spent 20 years of effort training users to do passwords that are really hard for them to remember, but really easy for computers to guess. Now, if you Google this, you'll find a blog by Pentest Partners that basically says this is bunk, but that blog is just terrible. They didn't really do the analysis right. There's actually been a paper done that did analysis of this comic in their method, and they found that not only, yes, the entropy is there, especially if you're using 5 common words, but they did a survey of hundreds of users, and they found that essentially using this method, the recall rate was significantly higher than with other forms of passwords while keeping that strong entropy. And it's not only, you know, this paper and XKCD that kind of have been touting this, right? And this guidance actually is moving more in this direction. They're now recommending that you should not impose complexity requirements, only length requirements. And you also should not require secrets to be periodically or arbitrarily changed. So this is NIST, right? This is government standards. They're saying no complexity requirements, no password changes. Now, if you're doing something like PCI still requires password changes, but they basically realized something that we've been seeing as pen testers for a long time, that these password rollovers at arbitrary, you know, intervals, as well as, you know, complexity requirements, basically have people choosing really weak passwords. You know, it's something that's based on like summer 2019 plus a predictable password, adding those things at the end. It's become really easy to predict. So moving away from that is something I think the industry is going to go to. But now we're in a position, right, where we're thinking, okay, well, how do we actually use a better password mechanism, right? If you're going to do the 4 random words, that's going to be really tough because you basically need to provide a password generator. Same for, you know, the NIST guidance. You want to change passwords when they've been breached. That doesn't necessarily mean that, you know, you need to change them every 90 days or every year, but then you need to have a mechanism in place to know that they're being breached, right? So what are some things that you guys can do to kind of start moving that direction without necessarily going all the way? The first thing is enforcing length tends to do a lot better than complexity rules. We definitely recommend everyone go to length 12 plus for your AD domain accounts if you can. That's going to basically force users to go to more passphrases, and they still may be choosing things with low entropy, but we've seen crack rates drop from, you know, as high as 50 to 60% with the next go around when they switch to 12 plus length down to 20%. And again, that could be something where, you know, you need to readjust the rules and readjust the program to get a little better, but that's going to give you a pretty good leg up almost immediately. Another thing you can do is enforce a blacklist, which essentially prevents any weak passwords from being used, right? And lastly, you know, kind of the ultimate thing is you can provide a generator tool that gives them passwords in an easy to remember structure, such as the 5 random words, and your users basically go and they generate that strong password. That's going to kind of be the ultimate, where you're now taking passwords out of the hands of the users. Now, I alluded to, you know, we talked about weak passwords. How can we exploit these? When we dive into the Microsoft section, I'll explain why. There's tons of ways to get NTLM handshakes or NTLM hashes, and these can be relatively easily then cracked offline. And you're basically taking the security of your authentications into the hands of the users, and basically they're only protected by the strength of that user's password because of the protocols in place in most Windows environments. So you need to make sure these passwords are strong, and so doing this can kind of really help you. Now, another problem with passwords, right, and NIST kind of was alluding to this as well, right? Even if you get them to be easy to remember, you still need to remember 10, hundreds of them, so you'll probably use the same one. And this is how you can get all your sites hacked from one breach. This is how, you know, data leaks, you know, another third-party, just consumer-facing site can affect your company because there may be shared passwords and people can cross-reference and figure out, you know, what the company ID is versus the data they found in the breach. And the key thing we see here that's a real big problem is shared local admin passwords. Now, the problem with this is if you have local admin on a system using the same password, that hash is going to be the same. If anyone gets local administrative access to that system, they can dump that hash, and then they don't even need to crack it. Even if it's a super strong 64-character random password, they can just use pass the hash and authenticate over any NTLM or Kerberos authentication mechanism. So how do you, kind of address, shared passwords and remembering? It's going to be hard to actually go through and again, do all the complexity, do all the, making sure if it's breached, we roll them. doing the password generator from the users. So one of the easier ways to get in front of that is just demote the password. Easier said than done, but using multi-factor authentication everywhere you can, even internally, can really, really give you a leg up. That's something where even if you're using weak passwords, or even if you're using strong passwords, and we have your credentials during a pen test, MFA can really put up a roadblock where it may not stop someone, but now they have to figure out, hey, how do we get your token? Maybe we have to, actually just grab a session by getting on, the target admin's workstation, and if it's a, web-based thing we're trying to get into, get the cookie and replay that. It makes things a lot harder for attackers. And it's something where if you can use it, people are using it very commonly for VPN, hopefully for OWA, any kind of email that's accessible externally. But it's not as common to see it used internally, and it's great to see it actually used for RDP, right? Make sure that whenever your admins try and get into, servers, they have to go through multi-factor to get there. One roadblock not roadblock, but trip up that people can run into when they're trying to implement two-factor internally, though, is there's not a lot of good two-factor tools for doing two-factor over RPC or SMB, right? Typically, it's only for RDP. And if you leave SMB open, port 445 or NetBIOS, 136, 139, or what have you, an attacker can still just get code execution through RPC calls on those ports, whether it's through WMI or decomp. But there's all sorts of gnarly stuff that's open on there. And I haven't seen a solution that reliably can put two-factor in front of all of them. So what we recommend doing, to demote the password is, require two-factor internally, and also pair that with network segmentation. So from, the workstation network where people have their computers, they can't hit those systems over SMB directly. They only can hit them over RDP, and then they can RDP in with two-factor, or, using a bashing host that requires RDP, then it gives you full access to, all the target systems that you want to administer. That, again, easier said than done. That's why it's a pain point. But, passwords are something that aren't going away. Multi-factor is something that's becoming more and more effective. There's better and better tools out there, and it is really great. So the more you can deploy it, the better. But ultimately, getting in front of these passwords and trying to get stronger passwords is going to help you a lot, because no matter how much multi-factor you put out there, passwords are still a key component of authentication. And if you're able to transition to that method where you help and get to that maturity model, you're going to have a much better time, a much lower crack rate. And, I guarantee you, if you come in and you have all your users using randomly generated 5-character passwords, not 5-character, that will be easily cracked. Randomly generated 5 random word passwords, it's going to be very difficult to get any kind of good cracks on those. And you're going to basically protect yourself against a whole litany of issues that where attackers can potentially, compromise you based on a weak password being in use. And, passwords are obviously painful, but as I've alluded to, there's a reason why they're even more painful in Windows environments, because there's so many things that in Windows environments can be used to basically break down a security to just the strength of the password. And there's a lot of things I want to go through here in this whole section on Microsoft, and it's a lot of just Microsoft, but why did you do this? And we'll go through all of these here and kind of explain what they are, how we use them on a pen test, how attackers use them, and what you can do to kind of get in front of them, and why in some cases they're either very painful to remediate or impossible. So the first thing is LMNR and NTLM, right? So, unlike entering a password on a website where you're protected by a handshake and a TLS tunnel where it's based on trust, or similar with SSH, right, where you do public-private key and or you're trusting that server, Microsoft basically decided on a handshake protocol for authenticating the systems. Now, this is better than plain text, but it's still basically, they're not very strong in the protocols in use for NTLM. And if you get an NTLM handshake where basically, hey, I'm trying to authenticate to a server, if I'm able to capture that handshake as an attacker, the security of the handshake basically is down to the complexity of the password. And as we know, our users are actually doing really terrible in general with choosing strong passwords. So if we can get a handshake, we can typically have a pretty good chance of cracking that handshake, getting the underlying password, and using that to then authenticate to further systems. Now, unfortunately, this is paired with another kind of Microsoft fault why, at least the handshake is somewhat understandable because it's a different mechanism than dealing with private and public key infrastructure and trust and things like that, own set of problems. But paired with multicast name resolution turned on by default, it can become quite an issue. So Windows by default, when you're resolving any DNS name, instead of going to the DNS server first, or only going to the DNS server, what you would think it would do, it actually first asks everyone on its local subnet, hey, who's got this thing I'm trying to get to? So you can imagine as an attacker, if we either fished our way in or on someone's computer or we're physically plugged in, we can run a tool like Responder or ports to Windows like Inve to basically respond to all those multicast name resolution requests and say, hey, yeah, I'm that guy. Go ahead and authenticate to me. Now, of course, once they try and authenticate to us, we get the handshake, which is protected only by the strength of the user's password. That's something we can then use to crack that password and potentially get access to the network. And this is something where it's almost like cheat mode on some pen tests, right? You come in, you just turn on Responder, and all of a sudden you get a domain admin hash and it's using a weak password. And okay, 20 minutes and I'm DA. That's something that's very common, and unfortunately, it's relatively difficult to turn off. The pain point part here is you have to turn off both local link multicast name resolution and NetBIOS to prevent this multicast DNS from happening. And NetBIOS, to turn that off, is, although LMNR you can turn off with a GPO relatively easily, NetBIOS is actually a registry change. And you think, okay, no big deal, I just changed that registry setting. Well, the registry setting is nested under the UUID of the network card of the specific computer. So you actually have to write a script that goes out, gets the UUID of the network card, finds that registry key, and changes it to turn it off, and then potentially, refresh the network, turn it on and off. It's just a pain. And so we see this. This has been known for a while as an issue, but it's still on by default for who knows what reason, and it's something that is highly prevalent and really easily exploited. This is something where, again, we wish Microsoft would just turn this off by default. I don't know why they have it on. They're just worried someone might come in with like a NT4 system. Who cares? At this point, they should just shut it off. And if you need to turn it on for legacy reasons, make people have to go in and work to turn it on. But having it on by default is a really bad idea, and it's probably making your network vulnerable. Now, NTLM handshakes, I mentioned, a handshake, it has some downsides to something like a Diffie-Hellman or whatever, but it does have some pluses, right? You don't have to have pre-configured trust, but the problem is the handshake needs to be strong, and NTLM version 1 is not strong. And you might say, well, everyone's using V2 now, what's the problem? Well, NTLM v1 is also known as MS-CHAP, which MS-CHAP is still in use in a lot of protocols. And MS-CHAP, Moxie Marlinspike did a great talk on this, I think back in 2012. He basically figured out that Microsoft added all these weird loops and extra steps, but ultimately it's just a single round of deaths. And we now have hardware ASICs that can crack deaths within 12 to 24 hours. And what that does is basically wrap an NTLM hash, and an NTLM hash, that is as good as the password in any kind of Windows environment. And what uses MS-CHAP? Well, it's used in PEEP. How many of you guys use PEEP? I'm sure a lot of people, if they're using enterprise Wi-Fi, you're probably using PEEP or protected EAP, and that's essentially a MS-CHAP handshake tunneled over TLS. Well, MS-CHAP is fail, right? So that means that basically TLS is your only real security. And because of that, the entire security of your setup now relies on client trust. Starting to sound familiar? I think a lot of people probably chose PEEP over EAP because they don't want to deal with the client trust. Now, the problem is, EAP TLS, you mess up your client trust, the Wi-Fi doesn't work. PEEP TLS, you mess up your client trust, the Wi-Fi works, it just works insecurely. So it's really the worst of both worlds. Anytime we see a PEEP network, we're like, no, you can do it correctly, but it relies on setting up the clients correct. So even if you set up 99% of your clients correct, there could be one that's just basically spitting out domain passwords to anyone who spins up a rogue access point. And the common pitfall here is if you're using a publicly signed certificate and you're saying, oh, I'm using public cert trust, well, an attacker can just buy that same certificate or buy a different certificate from that same vendor or any public certificate, and they're going to be trusted when they spin up a rogue SSID, and they're going to collect your MS-CHAP handshakes, which again they can trivially crack to get the NTLM hash, or if they're using weak passwords, just crack it outright. And that's something that we use pretty commonly to get onto people's wireless networks. Again, that's something where it's painful because ETLS is a lot of work from an administration perspective, but so is PEEP if you want to get it right. And it's better just to do ETLS if you can, to make sure that, yes, our Wi-Fi is only going to work if it's actually configured securely. Unlike PEEP will work even if you have insecure clients out there. Another thing that's kind of Microsoft but why is the architecture of Kerberos. I'm not going to dive too deep into it, but essentially, when you set up a service account as an SPN, which will happen, for instance, if you set up a service account on SQL Server, or there's plenty of applications that will set up themselves as an SPN when you install them and feed them a service account. The way it works is basically anyone now with domain access can request a TGS for that SPN. And not going into too much what the TGS does, that TGS essentially, like these handshakes, is kind of derived from the password. And so if you're using a weak password on any service account that's registered as an SPN, any domain user can basically get access to that password. That's something we see very commonly. We'll fish our way in. We'll get on someone's end user workstation. They don't have any access, but we just Kerberos and we get 10 to 15 service accounts, oftentimes from just developers or IT admins that have set themselves up as an SPN, maybe inadvertently. And any of them are using a weak password, which we talked about in passwords is relatively common. And we now have access to that service account. And you can imagine getting access to a service account. Service accounts tend to have a lot of reach in the environment. So this is something that can be like very dangerous, especially if you haven't, audited yourself against, okay, what SPNs do I have? What am I leaking? Because again, oftentimes we find where you might have 4 or 5 service account SPNs in, a mid-sized environment, but maybe you have 10 just random things that were set up inadvertently with users and things like that that really aren't necessary to be in an SPN. That's something where it can often lead to those have a weak password and you're able to, move from there. So what do you do to get in front of Kerberosing, right? That's something where we highly recommend that you basically periodically Kerberos yourself. There's a tool called Rubius that does this very well, .NET app. That essentially will be something that will let you, when you're Kerberosing yourself, that will let you see, okay, what are all my SPNs on here? And basically any account that's an SPN, that should just be a service account. So if there's any users in there, you just want to remove them. But they should essentially just be, go full out. Just make them 64-character random passwords because they aren't something that needs to be remembered by a human. They're really just for service accounts. And again, anyone could be able to request those password hashes if any kind of AD access, which again, that's typically where we land if we're fishing our way in. We're landing on a computer with AD access, and one of the first things we do is Kerberos. So make sure that you're Kerberosing yourself to understand, okay, what tickets are out there, what can an attacker get, and make sure all those accounts are using strong passwords. Because I'm reiterating this is a very common way for us to escalate and move off a compromised system very quickly. And I just saw a question in the chat. So that tool again is called Rubius, as in Rubius Hagrid. It was put out by Harmjoy, I believe last year. So R-U-B-E-U-S. There's other tools out there as well. I mean, there's, I think, PowerView will Kerberos, or the Sharp Viewport that we put out will Kerberos as well. There may be some better ways to do it with PowerShell as well. It's just, if you already have, if you just want to query all the SPNs in the environment. But I like running the offensive tool as an audit just because I'm more familiar with it. And also it's probably what attackers are going to be using. So you can get an idea of, hey, this is actually what's going to come back from the offensive tools. And you can see exactly what the attacker is going to see. So again, highly recommend using Rubius. And that's something we'll actually dive into a little further, kind of foreshadow as well, because there's more things you can do with tickets that are pretty fun using Rubius. Okay, great. So another thing, and this is, this has been going on forever, but everyone here by now has heard of Mimikatz. Windows stores plain text credentials in memory, right? And it's just unfortunate because we talk about pass to hash attacks. For Kerberos and NTLM, the hash is used as the root secret. So I don't even know why LSASS needs to store plain text credentials in memory when the hash is all you need to authenticate to any Windows, NTLM or Kerberos-based endpoint. But it's basically the worst of both worlds. And there's tons of tools to do it. I mean, Mimikatz has been around forever. You also can just dump LSASS to DLL. This is, still a very common way that will escalate and pivot within an environment. The key thing to note is, attackers running as admin can truly obtain these plain text passwords. Now, there's ways to kind of mitigate against it, but most of those aren't really that effective until you get into Windows 8, 8.1, or Windows 10 or Server 2016. And as we know, it's kind of a long-tailed upgrade that even as 2008 is approaching end of life, which again is going to be a huge pain point in and of itself when people are trying to upgrade off that. There's still a lot of Windows 2008 out there. And you have to turn on the protections for LSASS credential gathering. And there's multiple ways you can do it. There's the LSASS protections that come from basically using Vista's DRM that they originally made for, protecting music. That's kind of the first iteration of LSASS. Now Windows 10 and Server 2016 have a Hyper-V based protection where they're basically running, a hypervisor and then isolating LSASS in a separate, area of memory that, is above the OS where, you are. But again, that's something that hypervisor one is rarely deployed. But there are some configs you can put out to at least get in front of the plain text credential grabbing. but don't feel like you're safe quite then, because you still oftentimes can get the hash, which again, the hash is oftentimes all you need, or you can impersonate any users that are currently logged on there, and you'll have the ability to log in over NTLM or other protocols of whatever the current SSO session has. So even if you can't quite get the plain text credential, there's a lot you can do without that. And another thing you can do, again, mentioning Rubios, is just dump a ticking gradient ticket for any users on the system. And oftentimes, this is just what we do now, is we'll dump some TGTs and we'll do a pass the ticket attack instead. Almost the same effect of an LSS dump. Obviously, with clear text credentials, you're going to be able to do things like RDP, so you may have a different OPSEC profile. You may be limited there by not having plain text, but even if we can't get plain text out of LSS anymore, the effect is essentially the same. If you get on a system and you have local admin, basically any users that are currently logged on or have logged on recently, consider their security context completely compromised. There's just so many ways that we can go about getting access to those users, and the problem really becomes, once a breach occurs and once an attacker spread to a few servers, there's just so many ways in Windows environments you can just keep getting more access and keep spreading, and that's why things like multi-factor authentication, things like really strong network isolation, things like limiting your admin accounts so you don't have I'm just logging a domain admin everywhere, having separate admins for SQL Server, separate admins for the domain controller, separate admins for the servers is really important. That's where things like PAM can come in, where you're basically making sure that those passwords are unique in their role. There's a lot of things you can do to get in front of it, but because of Microsoft's just security model and the complexity of it and the SSO they've implemented, once you get on the system as local admin, just consider every security context on the system compromised, which again, it just explodes into possibilities of I get into a system and I have exponentially more systems I can hit until pretty much it's a snowball effect and you get domain admin. And a great way to visualize this, I don't know if any of you have heard of Bloodhound or seen it in our pen test reports or used it yourself. This is an awesome tool that basically goes out there and, like the name suggests, basically sniffs your environment and figures out all the relations of, hey, who has access to what do your group memberships look like, looking at, the entirety of your domain, who has sessions for what. And for an attacker, it's a great tool because we can basically say, let's say we fish into, Joe's computer, and I'm trying to get to the Alice domain admin. Bloodhound, you literally run it on Joe's computer with basic domain user creds, put in the search bar for Bloodhound, hey, I'm Joe and I want to get to Alice. It will just give us a nice map on, hey, yeah, you can log into this server, dump the tickets here, do a pass the ticket, get to that other system. It's so easy. And this is something that, not only is great for offensive use, this is really awesome as a defender tool, or even just as an IT admin tool, because you can have, ADOP is great, but this is an awesome visualization of your environment that you can run searches on, you can visually see what's going on, you can unnest groups. It's really an awesome, awesome tool, and I highly recommend you guys actually check this out. Even if you don't want to hack into your environment, just looking at, the map of it, it's amazing. And you don't have to be a domain admin to run this. Any domain user in most environments is sufficient, and you can get an awesome map of what's going on. Now, speaking of that, we do find a very common issue when running this, where we see in a lot of environments, the domain users group being inadvertently added to the local admin group on one or more servers. I don't know why this is so prevalent, but we see this all the time. And it might just be, maybe you have 1,000 servers in your environment, only 3 of them have domain users. But what that means is I run Bloodhound, I see that, and I can just, okay, well, I know I have local admin there. I'm just going to go straight to that server. And now you've gone from compromising a user workstation that might have nothing on it and no local admin rights to local admin on a handful of servers. So if anything, if you guys do run that tool, the first thing I would do is just look at the domain users group and see what they have access to. See what everyone can get to. Run a search of, hey, go to domain users to domain admin. And you'll find probably a path to do that. And shutting down that path is going to be great. So what are some recommendations for these Microsoft issues? These things, again, a lot of them are just, past the hash, you can't get around because that's how NTLM and Kerberos works, right? But there's things you can get in front of. The first thing is strong passwords, especially for service accounts. And this is really important for service accounts, especially that can be Kerberosed. We mentioned users do a poor job in general of choosing passwords, but there's no excuse for IT. IT should just be 32, 64 plus random characters for service accounts. It's remembered by a computer, not by a human. Just make it random and super long. Disabling LMNR and NetBIOS, again, easier said than done on the NetBIOS side, but there are scripts out there to do that. There's a great white paper, which I'll see if I can link after this, that basically has it's sad when you have a white paper to turn this off. I think it's literally 20 pages of how you can turn this off. You know, Microsoft messed up when you need a 20-page white paper to say how to turn this off. But I recommend looking at that because it kind of explains how you can go about turning it off. And unless you have, you know, a server farm of Windows 2000 servers, you're probably not gonna have an issue. And if you do have a server farm of like Windows 2000 servers, you probably should shut those off anyway. So there's really no risk of disruption here, unless you're really using NetBIOS heavily in your environment, and you probably shouldn't. Another thing is use SMB signing. We actually, I think I skipped that one here, but we mentioned cracking handshakes, which relies on a user password. But let's imagine in your environment, you have LMNR enabled, but you have really strong passwords and we can't crack the handshakes. Well, if you're not using SMB signing, we don't even need to crack them. We can just relay them on. And this is something that's been, I mean, when did the SMB relay come out of Metasploit? It's been out for a decade, right? It's been used forever, but the tools keep getting better. I think multi-relay is still it's open source on GitHub and people are still contributing to that. I think Lauren Gabb is still making contributions to the project as well. And it just keeps getting better. And the tools for this really are awesome. And we'll leverage that to relay authentication to another system. And, you know, we don't even need to know the password. It could be a service account that's calling out the long 32-character password. But if you don't have SMB signing to prevent relaying, we can just relay that and get local admin on whatever system we're trying to do. So combination of those two, LMNR, NetBIOS, and SMB signing, that is like the cheat mode on pen test. And it's going to be the cheat mode for attackers too. So if you can turn those off, that's going to make a huge difference. Shared local admin passwords, like I mentioned, that's still a huge problem of we compromise one system. Maybe we get, we escalate the local admin access on there. We dump the hashes. If that admin password is shared, all of a sudden we have access to every workstation in your environment, right? We just get beacons on NT, on 80 admin computers. We get beacons on potentially servers using that shared password. So luckily, there's a lot of tools out there to prevent that use of shared password. Labs is great. It's from Microsoft and it's totally free. And it's basically designed to address that. It's going to rotate all your local admin passwords. If anything, just deploy Labs and use Labs if you're not already, and if you don't have a PAM, because it's one of those things. It's super easy to deploy. I haven't got nothing but positive feedback from our clients that use that, and it's going to foil an attack vector that we use all the time. Now, if you want to kind of go to the next level, there's a lot of PAM solutions out there as well that also will do a good job. In fact, they're obviously going to do better than Labs. They can be much more functional, but they're more complicated, more expensive to deploy. If you're not doing anything, I would just do Labs right away and then maybe start looking at PAM. And if you're already doing Labs, maybe start looking at PAM. PAM can give you some flexibility to kind of get in front of these other issues where, hey, we try and tamp down on that scenario where I just keep getting more and more snowballing access by, really isolating accounts to only specific, subsets of systems. So if I compromise, let's say the Oracle servers or the Citrix server farm, I don't have admin accounts on there that I dump their tickets for. They're plain text creds probably still, and can use those to pivot, right? They're only isolated to admins to that specific environment to kind of keep things contained. And PAM makes that a little easier to architect and do, because you can imagine manually trying to manage, okay, I've got to log into my Citrix admin account. Okay, I got to log into my, most people just do two. They do the domain admin and a standard account, which really doesn't add much protection, to be honest. You really have to isolate it much more granularly, and PAM can do something to kind of help you improve that. Multi-factor everything, if you can. Again, even internally, I know we talked about that on passwords too, but putting multi-factor in front of your Windows systems is huge. And we've seen people be very successful in stopping us. We've got in admin creds and we can't pivot quite to that environment. Or maybe we can, but it requires much more work to get to a point where we can pivot to that environment. Again, it's key. You need network isolation too, because if you have multi-factor on RDP, we've seen this also a bunch of times. Hey, we have multi-factor. Well, you don't have multi-factor on your, WMI or SMB, and we can just go in that way. So either, network isolation is the easy way to address that. It's hard to get that turned off or clamp down on the OS level. It's much better just, hey, make sure that where an attacker's landing or where, everyone's sitting from, hey, user perspective, they have to go through a jump box, or they have to only hit RDP in order to get into the systems. And if they want to do something like, hey, I have IT automation scripts that obviously need to hit WMI, they need to do that from a Bastion OS. And I mentioned, multi-factor may not stop someone, but they're going to have to go to much further lengths, which is where detection, prevention, and monitoring come into play, right? If you have detection in place, there's no way you're going to detect everything. Our payloads that we use pretty much get past any AV. And as long as we're not doing very blatantly obvious things, like, again, we typically won't dump LSAS anymore because most EDRs are going to be like, hey, someone's got a memory handle with LSAS. That's going to be a major alert. That's why things like dumping tickets, even if we can dump LSAS, we typically go the ticket route now. But proactive monitoring is going to be great because eventually the attackers probably going to trip something. They're going to trip over something and trigger an alarm. And so, again, if you're keeping them at bay with multi-factor, with all these things, they're having to try more and more aggressive tactics until eventually, hopefully, the detections you have in play light up. Now, right now, EDR seems to be the best thing, at least just from our limited view of, hey, we're doing a lot of pen testing, and most of the ways, especially on red teams where we're getting actually caught, is from something tripping something in an EDR system and that raising an alert and going to, eventually the SOC or the blue team. Network detections are great too. Frequency monitoring is awesome. Typically, and frequency monitoring for IPs and domains, typically nowadays most of our C2 we do is over HTTPS. Typically, actually, it's easier to get caught if you're doing something kind of novel like going over DNS or ping, just because that looks really out of place if you're looking for it. But we highly recommend you look for that, right? Keep a track of DNS traffic, keep track of ICMP, look for oddities there, and do at least frequency analysis on HTTPS, right? We highly recommend actually blocking outright any uncategorized domains. That can have some user disruption, but that greatly increases the cost of an attacker because we can't just spin up things willy-nilly. We have to spin up the domain, put some fake site on there, submit it to, Forescout or WebSense, like, hey, you need to go, this site is good, go categorize it. Not hard to do, but it takes time. And, for attackers, if they're coming after you for financial reasons, time is money. So anything you can do to prevent that there is going to be awesome. And again, I was going to say detection of uncategorized domains and frequency analysis of them to see, hey, we got one computer connecting to this a ton, or, this domain, there's a huge spike in connections. But outright blocking uncategorized domains is a good thing to go. And that actually ties into phishing and T2. So we want to talk about phishing, right? This is extremely painful, and why? It's really the most common initial vector, and the reason is it's easy. It's easy for an attacker, and it has no risk. Again, like passwords, we're leveraging your users. So it's not something where IT can just flip the switch and say, yeah, we're going to disable phishing, right? No, you have to educate your users. You could say there's technical controls on spam. Proofpoint does a pretty great job at some things, but it's hard to actually stop everything without starting to disrupt real email. And it's relatively easy for us still to get emails through, even if you're using something like Proofpoint. It's good for being able to block something, but ultimately that initial emails are going to come through. And it's virtually unlimited tries for an attacker. A lot of people are really concerned about physical aspects. That's something we're doing more and more, where we break into a building and hey, you don't want to be Fort Knox, so we come and we place a device, and then oftentimes it kind of snowballs from there. But in reality, you're not going to be targeted by physical attackers as frequently as emails or at all, because it's much higher risk for an attacker to try and put themselves on a limb, come on site, potentially get arrested. Emails, they can just do from Estonia, right? They're just sitting there and no one's going to prosecute them. It's virtually unlimited tries with no risk for the attacker, and it's relatively cheap. So here's the comment. For whatever reason, people love clicking this e-card thing. We've been doing this for years. So this is an example of a phishing email. I don't know why everyone wants to get this, oh man, I got my e-card. I really want to download that. This is something we still use to great success. An example of a phishing email that might come through, right? Nothing too crazy. Just, you got an e-card, go ahead and download that. Even if we're doing something like an HTA file that is going to have a ton of warnings, we've seen unbelievable click-through rates. But the good news is these warnings are relatively common, right? So, I mean, there's things you can educate a user on that kind of tie into, first of all, they're either going to be trying and collect credentials, which probably if they're collecting credentials, they're going to use a login page that looks more like whatever login page you have externally, because they don't care about the personal credentials as much unless they're being shared. Or they're going to try and get payload execution, or both. And payload execution is really the one that I think is a little more scary in most cases, especially if you are using multi-factor prolifically throughout the environment, or at least externally. But payloads in most cases will have warnings. Now, I will say, kind of as a side note here, we moved on actually. It's funny, we're kind of going back in time. Most of our phishing payloads now are just executables. We just have signed executables, because once you have hosted them long enough, they no longer have warnings. If they're signed, Smart Screen doesn't bypass them. Really, the only case where phishing with executables doesn't work well is with if you're using application whitelisting. But nowadays, if you're trying to phish with like a Word doc, especially if you have Windows Defender, man, Windows Defender is insane at finding malware in Word docs now. It's better than any other commercial AV you've seen. But HCA files, same thing. There's a ton of warnings from HCA files, VB scripts, all the things that used to be easy peasy have gotten a little harder. So we've kind of gone back to executables, at least for us, and to get successful. So just kind of an interesting tangent there. But you're going to get phished. Someone's going to try and get payload execution. So what do they get? Well, 80 access. That's huge, right? So what can they do now? They can Kerberos. They can run Bloodhound, get a full map of your domain. They can get a full dump of the directory list. So further phishing emails. They can get access to that person's emails and internal phishing emails, right? How many people have SMB shares in their environments? How many people know what's on their shares and know there's no sensitive information there, right? You get initial access, you have share access, you probably have more access than you should have in most cases. And the third point is just internal network access. Having internal network access oftentimes is game over. So now you can start looking for, hey, I can start using Responder or multi-relay. I can start getting those hashes. The attack surface areas just could be much larger. We still are seeing MS-1710, and actually on a funny side note, we ported MS-1710 to PowerShell so we could just, get on a system and just run it in PowerShell really quickly, assuming you're not blocking PowerShell. And someone actually took that and made a Monero miner out of it. So that was, sorry, I guess, for unleashing that upon the world. But an attacker can very easily basically start pivoting internally. There's typically a much broader attack surface area than you can have externally. So even just that, that initial computer leveraging all those things we talked about, especially those Windows issues, having internal access is gold. And oftentimes it's game over as soon as you get to that point. Now, that being said, it's game over in a certain time frame. And that's where detections come in, right? So we talked about a little bit about command and control. Typically, the way we set things up nowadays is we're mostly using HTTPS redirectors, where we spin up a bunch of servers in the cloud in Azure. We really like spinning up servers in Azure just because if you guys have ever looked at your network logs, oh my gosh, Microsoft makes so many calls to Azure and so many different processes. So it's very easy to blend in if you're not looking at the domains because there's so much traffic going to Azure, especially on Windows 10. It's pretty nutty. So we tend to blend in that way by going out to Azure. And then that redirects back to our C2, and we can go from there. And again, Hackerman's there, basically sitting behind everything. All you see are calls out to Azure, and we have a lot of domains that we'll buy, and attackers will buy this too, like msdnlive.com. It kind of looks legit at first glance. The redirectors will set up so when you hit it, it will redirect to a real MSDN site. It takes a little bit further just diving in to see what's going on there, but that's where, again, doing the frequency analysis of domains of like, hey, why are all these systems all of a sudden going to msdnlive.com? Even oftentimes you're just doing the top 10 domains. If the attacker gets to a point where they need to have, fast internal network access to tunnel something like RDP, or maybe to tunnel, something through a web page through SOCs, they're going to basically start beaconing really aggressively, and they may, reveal themselves that way by saying, hey, there's actually a ton of traffic now going out to these domains. And that's something where, again, the attacker's probably going to escalate to that level of doing something like that if you don't have all the super easy stuff there, right? So if you got rid of Kerberosing, if you got rid of, if you're multi-factor everywhere, you got rid of LMNR, the attackers are going to have to try some more aggressive things, and that's where you might see that beaconing tick up, and you might have a chance to catch them. So what are some recommendations for phishing? So the first thing is, again, blacklist uncategorized domains and proxy and email servers. Just there's no good reason to have uncategorized domains open. There might be some Bobo sites that users can no longer get to, but in general, it's worth whatever that is, and you can always do them categorized if not. Now, it may be, again, an uptick in some help desk traffic if you're blocking a lot of things. So maybe first look at your list of uncategorized domains and look at the ones that are commonly hit. Make sure those are legitimate, first of all. And if they are, you can whitelist those. That way you'll kind of get in front before you start blocking. But ultimately, just blocklist those. It's going to make it harder for an attacker to get in. And again, there's a lot of attackers that are just lazy, right? Again, time is money. They're just going to start phishing. And they're not just targeting you, they're targeting a whole bunch of people, and maybe their domains are blocked by you, but they're not blocked by someone else. They're probably gonna go after someone else. It's one of those things, right? Like if you're hiking and a bear is chasing you, you don't have to be faster than the bear, you just have to be faster than the slowest person, right? A lot of that kind of applies here. It's kind of sad, but blacklisting is gonna put you ahead of the pack, makes you faster than the slowest person. The last thing is training, or next thing is training. Really, it's great to have a system in place if you can to have where users are basically able to quickly report emails, right? There's a lot of tools out there, a lot of platforms, there's subscription platforms, but there's also open source tools where you can basically put hooks into your Outlook where if a user gets something suspicious, they can basically click there immediately, it will send to the deleted folder, and it will send to IT to do analysis on or warn users. And we've seen companies that are doing this have tremendous increases in their ability to resist phishing attacks. We just did, actually, one of our clients And we've just, it was incredible actually how well they did. And it's because the users had total buy-in. You know, they felt like they were helping, right? It was great. They didn't feel like they were being punished, like, oh man, we have to like worry about these phishing emails. They had really great buy-in, and just having that Outlook plugin in there and tying that to training and security awareness can go a really long way. The next thing is making sure you have a good containment and removal policy in place. So really want to make sure when you do detect phishing that you take the right steps. You know, it's incredibly common for us on red teams to be detected, but the client doesn't do the follow-up work to figure out, okay, well, who opened this email? What domain was it going to? Making sure that that's all tracked back, contain the compromised system, and they say compromised, and we're able to escalate and go to DA. So you don't want that to happen in reality, right? Because you would hate to have, you know, hey, we were alerted on that phishing email, we blocked the email, but you know, the payload execution already happened and it's already beaconing out. So you want to make sure you do investigation, you do follow up, especially if you click that link, investigate, and see that it's downloading an executable or downloading an HTA or downloading some other kind of payload. You've got to do those containment steps. Really, really important. We have some clients that are so aggressive that they'll literally just wipe the system as soon as there's a phishing alert. Now, that works in some verticals and industries, especially if you have a large staff, but that's going to be infeasible in a lot of cases. But at least, you know, following up on, hey, you know, what was that domain? Let's block that domain in the firewall. Let's investigate the link and see the payload. Let's run the payload in a sandbox. What was it calling out to? Block those links. Look in our firewall for anything that's speaking out to that, and make sure we go to those user systems and remove the beacon. Now, again, ideally you want to wipe the systems because you could have all sorts of mischief that an attacker can do there. But you know, at least containing the callbacks and removing the beacons. Oftentimes restarting is good before they can get persistence. This can go a long way. Fourthly, just if you can, completely block word macro and HTA file execution, right? Cylance, you know, it's funny because they just totally block this. I think now they actually do some script scanning. I think when it first came out, they just straight up just block. They're like, no, we'll just totally disable it, and that's how they protect against it. But it's actually a pretty good strategy. I don't think there's any legitimate use for HTA files, which, if you guys don't know, this is actually another Microsoft, like, what's the point of this? It's an HTML application. It's essentially a web page that has full access to the Win32 API, right? Great idea. These things are great payloads, or used to be great payloads, because you just, you know, run this HTML file or HTA file and you get code execution on the system. There's a lot more alerting on that now. I recommend completely blocking that. The only legitimate HTA file I've ever seen was for some Amazon.com, like, weird feature that used an HTA file. And unless your users are like using Amazon Marketplace for some reason, they don't need HTA files. I would just turn that off. Same with word macros. Sale macros, you know, there's a lot of people that still have to use that because it's very powerful and very good for, you know, finance and things like that. But, you know, at least blocking anything coming in, preventing them from downloading work macros from other sites is going to go a long way. And again, Windows Defender is actually really good at blocking word macros. I think the payload we have now actually hides it in like an image and extracts it from the image and the thing. And I think that even just recently got burned by Windows Defender. If you're using Windows 10, Windows Defender with cloud protection on is very sweet and very good for blocking macros. And then lastly, just having a process in place to respond. I mean, we talked about containing and removing compromised systems, but, you know, that's just, you know, talking about it. You need to have a process and just kind of something to walk through, and even as simple as a checklist, right, or a high-level procedure. You'd be surprised at, you know, how much even something that is very basic just can provide so much guidance and stability when you do get into a crisis situation. The last thing you want to do, responding to, hey, we've been phished, multiple payloads executed, what do we do? If you're running all directions. If you can run down through something, you know, that's going to help you just get to work a lot more quickly, and hopefully get in place and kind of shut down the compromise system. So having a process in place to respond, knowing what to do ahead of time, that's going to help you just act much more quickly and prevent you getting to the situation where, you know, you've gotten into a breach situation. Great. Click here. So we talked about a lot here, right? And general recommendations, multi-factor authentication can really save you. Use it everywhere you can. Now, especially externally. I would say externally, if you're not using multi-factor authentication for any authentication externally, it's not sufficient. You need to have multi-factor in front of email. You need to have multi-factor in front of VPN. You need to have multi-factor in front of any kind of like company portal or things like that. It's really important. The common thing we see now is, you know, email accessible without multi-factor. And that is great for us on our red team because there's oftentimes people using weak passwords that we can guess or have been in leaks, or maybe we've gotten from some other kind of testing of another application or another area of the organization. And if we get that, having email access is a really great almost persistence mechanism because it's much easier to do a phish internally. And we can do so much research. Once we have access to OWA, we can dump to the directory list, which of course can be great for phishing. And that's something you can't take back, right? Once we dump the directory list, unless you're going to change everyone's email or fire everyone and have a new group of users, the attacker has that directory list, essentially public, and they can keep using that to try and phish their way in. So it's going to be a headache. So multi-factor, all the things. And again, internally, super great. We haven't seen reliable multi-factor for WMI or things like that. So ideally, internally, multi-factor RDP in concert with network segmentation. Kind of daunting, but we've seen people implement it successfully, and it really, really can do a great job at preventing a breach from snowballing out of control. EDR is great for detection. The problem is I think the EDR companies know that right now, so they are, they're kind of, they know their stuff doesn't stink essentially. So EDR, it's not perfect, but we definitely recommend, having some kind of EDR in place. And even if you have normal AV in place, that's fine. Just make sure you're alerting on that. We see so many times where we've actually tripped up like semantic antivirus or Trend Micro or something doing something dumb. And yeah, we triggered an alert, deleted our payload, but that alert just went to a black hole, right? And we just repayloaded the system and continued on. Antivirus alerts are going to be an awesome source of, detection, essentially. I don't put too much stake in antivirus actually stopping anything, but it's going to do great at, if an attacker messes up, which, they can do it eventually. It's going to be really good to make sure you're monitoring those alerts. Thirdly, no local admin for normal users. A lot of the things we talk about in Windows, LSS dumping, dumping Kerberos tickets, dumping the local admin SAM, and then using shared passwords, those are only possible with local admin rights. So ideally, all your normal users should not have local admin. And what's the domain users rights? Again, if you guys do download and mess around with Bloodhounds, we've got a blog post on our site actually that walks through how to download and set it up and tutorial and run it. It's pretty straightforward. The first thing I would do is look at the domain users group and see what it has, where it can get to. Because you may be surprised where you see some pretty quick hops to domain admin from your domain users group, which again, translated, that means anyone with AD access can get domain admin by following those steps. So highly recommend that. And you'll see a lot of CAN RDP rights. You'll see a lot of admin rights potentially in there that attackers can use to pivot to get to other systems and again, snowball on from there. Next, this is kind of just, default configurations and patching. So default configurations, that ties into SMB siding and LMNR. Definitely want to harden those. In patching, that's still something that's a huge issue. And one of the things we've seen too is we've seen a lot of organizations where, they're doing vulnerability scanning and they're patching everything they see, but they're doing it against a list of hosts. We come in and we're trying to, we don't care what you think your asset list is. We're looking at whatever's on there, right? We recommend you do the same thing. Just run a vuln scan against all your internal network subnets, full spread. If things are breaking because of a vuln scan, get those things out of your environment. You should not be breaking anything from a vuln scan in 2019. So this is something we highly recommend. Just do vuln scanning on your own regularly, monthly, and remediate the things that come up. Now, again, that's something where it's a pain point, right? Because that can be a lot of work. Especially on some of the default configurations like LNR that are not trivial to patch. Especially on things where it's like we've got tons of patching issues across disparate systems. But again, if you can patch all your Windows problems, make sure that you're first of all scanning for everything and you're not missing like an MS-1710 vulnerable system out there, which again, still hugely common when we come into an environment and we find a handful of systems that still are vulnerable to MS-17, and typically it's because they, for whatever reason, are not included in the vuln scanning, so kind of flew under the radar. That's something attackers are going to find. It's something they're going to exploit. You want to definitely get in front of that. And lastly, I talked about PEEP, but I'd highly recommend everyone moving over to ETLS for wireless networks if you can, because I don't think we've yet really seen a good deployment of PEEP. And again, the problem is with PEEP, I don't have it on there, I'm just kind of going on my own now, but the problem with PEEP is that, just to reiterate, it's wholly reliant on client trust, basically reliant that you set up every single client correctly. So it's not like a global switch you turn on, oh, I need to make sure my radius server is secure, or I need to make sure my access point is secure. It's like, is every device connected to your wireless network? Are you sure that's configured correctly? And of course you could say, yeah, a group policy pushing out to, all our laptops. What about devices? How are they connecting? Are they connecting over PEEP? How are you securing them? Do you have an MDM? Does it have full coverage? Does it work the same for every device? What about all the different version numbers of the OS, iterations of the devices? You can see where you quickly can get into a situation where things can basically, you can miss a couple things. So that's why we recommend moving EPLS if you can. So with that, I know we covered a lot, and I've been told I talk really fast. And I think especially now, I was kind of jumping around a little bit more than I typically have when going through the slide deck. So with that, I don't know if anyone has any questions they want to go through. I'm happy to answer, address them, or dive into any other topics that you guys might be interested in.
Yeah, Kevin, I see here in the chat we have a few. So what are the most common of these issues you encounter?
Shared local admin passwords are still incredibly common. But I'd say overall, it's local multicast name resolution is the most common issue we encounter. And the reason for that, again, is because it's so dang hard to turn off. It's one of those things where it's just, even if you turn, like we've had clients where we've worked through them because it was an issue for PCI. It was affecting, being able to get in the PCI environment. They needed to turn it off. And it was like a month-long process to get it finally turned off, back and forth with us checking and helping them. And then, next year, some more systems were on again. It's just, like I said, when there's a 20-page white paper to turn this thing off, which shouldn't be on in the first place, Microsoft messed up. So that's the most extremely common. And again, we'll probably link to that white paper, just because, yeah, that's something if you can get in front of that and turn that off because attackers aren't going to be leveraging it. And I see someone asked, yep, so we'll be able to share that slide deck, most definitely. And I think we have this session recorded. I don't know if that goes out as well for people.
Yeah, we can send out the recording as well.
Awesome.
And then the final question I think that we have time to address today is, if you could choose one thing to focus on, what would you recommend people focus on?
Yeah, good question. So, it's actually kind of spoiler alert. We've talked about that a few times on here, right? Multi-factor, it just works so well. It's one of those things where having that, something that an attacker can't get access to very easily, like passwords, just can get in their way so well. And passwords, we talk about passwords. A lot of the problem were with users choosing poor entry passwords. But another problem is just how easy they are to get. I mean, there's so many different ways where we end up getting people's passwords, whether it's through phishing, whether it's through, dumping out tests, whether it's through, cracking a hash from collecting the hash on excuse me, it's hard to say this thing, LMNR. There's so many ways we can get access to the password, and conversely, there's a lot fewer ways for us to get access to the multi-factor token. Now, I will say we've done pretty successful phishing attacks where we basically spoof the multi-factor token page, and so we're just waiting, and when they enter the cred, and they enter the multi-factor token, and we're over on like another screen logging into your Citrix or your VPN, but that's a one-time use, right? And that's a lot harder for an attacker to do, and once you cut them out, they're out. Actually getting access to the root token can be a lot more difficult. That being said, we have some cases where multi-factor is either tied directly to email, so we can get an email about multi-factor and then get access from there, or people have put in the multi-factor token seeds into their LastPass, and that also has been ways that we've been able to kind of get around that. But in general, multi-factor can either require us to jump through many more hoops than we would have to otherwise, and something that just is great for slowing down an attacker and in many cases stopping them.
Excellent, thank you, Kevin. Well, I think we are at the time here. So with that, if you have any questions, feel free to reach out to us, and we will follow up with links and slides and recordings. Thank you guys for joining.
Awesome, thanks guys.